Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the National Council for Teachers of Mathematics virtual conference. I am going to be one of your speakers tonight, Queshonda Kudaisi, and we have...
I am Matt O'Brien. We are both math education doctoral students at the University of South Florida, and we are excited to talk to you guys about implementing the core practices for math coaches and administrators to improve instruction.
Yes. And by the way, I am an instructional math coach for my district. And Matt, tell them a little bit about what you do.
So I spent 14 years in the classroom, and currently right now I am working with pre-service elementary ed teachers in elementary math methods courses at University of South Florida. So we're going to take a look at how core practices that we implement in the elementary pre-service teacher setting, how we can take that and apply that to teachers that are currently in the field.
Yes. So we're trying to bridge that gap there. So what I want you to take a second to do, even though I know this is a recording, we should be right there in the chat with you. And so we just ask that you type one practice that you or your math teachers could focus on to improve student outcomes. So take a few seconds to do that, and then we'll come back later to that in the PowerPoint. So now Matt is going to tell us a little bit about the significance of what we're talking about and what kind of really built up or led up to where we are today.
So the core practices is based on a historical context. We look back to like John Dewey. John Dewey wanted to look at exemplary teachers. He didn't want to hide these teachers in their classroom. He wanted to share their effective teaching strategies with their colleagues to improve other teachers. And he didn't want to just use theoretical, he wanted to involve a certain amount of practical work. So Dewey explained that there's far too much waste in education to expect individual teachers to find out on their own the pronesis of teaching. Dewey wanted to analyze exemplary teachers, find out what common characteristics of practice the teachers enacted. So what that means is that core practices are highly effective teaching practices that happen in classrooms of highly effective teachers. So in the 1960s and 70s, the theoretical framework for educational research was a behavioral model of learning, and we had a lot of competency-based teacher education, and the pedagogy of micro-teaching emerged. So we learned teachers that were in pre-service teachers learned about, it was a lot of checklists of trying to improve. And then in the 80s, we shifted towards a cognitive psychology perspective. So educational research changed from teacher behaviors to teachers' thinking and knowledge. So and math teacher educators shifted teaching preparation programs from the episteme, the science of teaching, to the pronesis, the art of teaching. Shulman explained the definition of effective teaching is not a collection of behavioral proficiencies, rather a collection of moment-to-moment judgments that the educators need for the knowledge to apply towards students' instructional learning outcomes and discipline. So if we look at, we've had a pendulum swing in terms of education. And under the No Child Left Behind Act and 2001, then we came with Common Core. And we looked at as our math curriculum was an inch deep and a mile wide. And we kind of almost look at as our teacher professional development curriculum was kind of the same way. So we had the creation of the Common Core standards, and teacher educators needed to prepare pre-service teachers for student-centered learning and narrowing the gap from teacher to practice. So it was no longer the teacher was dispersing knowledge, the teacher was facilitating student learning. So teacher preparation needed to take a look at pronesis versus episteme. And this is the unbridgeable gap between our world and the student's experiences. This is an excellent way of conceptualizing the impact of the difference between episteme and pronesis in teacher education, which is the unbridgeable gap. Episteme, as described by Cothringen, is propositional knowledge that apply to many different situations and problems, which is almost an episteme that then is traditional scientifically derived knowledge that is often described in abstract terms and considered to be objective and timeless. Pronesis is a form of practical wisdom, really is the art of teaching that is derived through understanding specific situations. Teacher educators need to be challenged about the why of practice, not just the how of practice, in order to articulate their own understanding. So it's really important that we get teachers to reflect on the how and the why of their teaching practices. So here is the development of the core practices. So the core practice consortium was 31 expert teacher educators from 9 universities. And some of these universities include Boston Teacher Residency, San Francisco State University, Stanford University, UCLA, University of Colorado, University of Illinois Chicago, University of Michigan, University of Notre Dame, University of Pennsylvania, Virginia, or University of Virginia, University of Washington, and University of Wisconsin. They were looking to define common vocabulary, and they wanted to look at practices that happen in different contents, and they wanted to look at are the core practices the same among ELA, math, social studies, and science, or are they different? And they also wanted to find the grain size of a core practice. So if we take a look at, there was 4 universities and groups that collaborated, and the whole goal was to unpack effective teaching practices, develop strategies and tools for teaching, integrate methods and foundation classes, and create instructional activity cycles. So we no longer had, math teachers took content area, and for elementary math teachers, took specific content classes and then had methods. We wanted to take the methods and content, blend them together, but also teach these high leverage practices. So think back to how you respond to this question. In the chat, type one practice that you and your math teachers could focus on to improve student outcomes. So we're going to show you what teachers responded. And we saw a lot of good comments here. So one of the things that we noticed was there was comments about standards of math practice. So the core practices are teacher moves, where the standards of math practice are student moves for doing math. The standards of math practice were developed based on 8 highly effective habits of mathematicians, where the core practices focus on what teachers can do to facilitate learning and increase student learning outcomes. So if we take a look here, we notice that a lot of the comments that were made by teachers that are circled relate to core practices. The ones that did not mostly dealt with specific skill sets. And so high leverage practices is the root of core practices. One of the first things they did is they wanted to define what a core practice was. And they believed it was a high leverage practice because this is a practice that is the most fundamental of teaching. It's constantly used, and it is extremely critical to improve student understanding of a specific content. The high leverage practices allow students to increase their social and emotional development based on constructivist tenets. And we see these high leverage practices used across all grade levels, all subject areas, and different contexts. So if you go to the library at teacherworks.org, they have a lot of really good practices that explain, that go into depth, and they also have videos sometimes available. So if we take a look at what are high leverage practices. So based on Pam Grossman from the University of Pennsylvania, teaching core practices in teacher education, we have 6 core practices. And these 6 practices, so in the 3 math courses, elementary math courses that we teach at University of South Florida, we're looking to implement as many of these high leverage practices in our method/content course that we offer. So we're looking to elicit student ideas. We're looking for teachers to lead a discussion, facilitate an instructional conversation, which means we're getting students to, we're probing instead of guiding student thinking, we're scaffolding. So we're providing support that enables students to make progress on a task. We're creating that classroom culture, increasing the growth mindset, creating specific structures and procedures to best facilitate constructivist learning. And we also need to look at learning about student understanding through formative and summative assessments. So, we, in our methods courses, we want to have students have formative assessment ideas already created. So that way, when they get in the classroom, they already have that built into the lesson. And we also want students to work together. So we have these 6 high leverage practices, but then we want to enact on these practices. So we have the instructional activity cycle, which is for our pre-service teachers. And part of me was thinking, before when we were developing this presentation, I wanted to work with Queshonda because she's the math coach at a high school, and how we could incorporate this instructional activity cycle for teachers that are currently in the classroom. So what happens here is we introduce a core practice. We might watch a video, I might model it, and we will prepare that core practice by rehearsing or collaborative planning with their cooperating teacher. We enact on the activity, and then we will either do video analysis or some type of analysis to go over how the actual enactment happened. And this is the cycle that we try to incorporate. And what we're trying to do is our goal is to do as many instructional activity cycles as we can of the 6 practices in our methods courses. So now we're looking at math.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about in-service teachers. So Matt just kind of showed you what he did in his methods courses with his pre-service teachers. And so me and Matt really wanted to look at, how he was doing it with his pre-service teachers and how we could kind of translate that practice with in-service teachers. And so as a mathematics coach, we have actually started the process of doing this. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. But before I talk to you about that process that we engaged in, I want to talk to you a little bit about math coaching and what it is and what it's not. And so it's not football, but I'm going to go a little bit more into what it is. So math coaching is really about a model for sustained growth, right? Cohen Ball and Cohen in 1995 said this. They said, for many years, professional development classes, seminars, lectures, and interactive sessions have taken place. Cognizant of the fact that traditional one-stop workshops and go-away professional conferences are ineffective routes for sustained growth, many locales are embracing coaching as a model of professional development for teachers. So I believe what these researchers are saying is that, we learn so many things at these professional conferences, right? NCTM being one of these conferences that we're at right now. And we as teachers get so excited when we learn something and we want to go and implement it in the classroom. But often that fire just begins to die, right? Whether that be because you're overwhelmed with happenings at the school or, things may be going on at home or whatever the reason is, like you get excited at conference time and then the school year really kicks in and that kind of fades. Well, the role of the mathematics coach is actually to keep that fire burning, to be there, to remind you of your goals, to remind you of those things that you wanted to do. And so that's really the role of the math coach. Jim Knight, who's like the father of math coaching, I'm sure there's probably other people who've contributed to the field as well, but he's really the person that I first heard about coaching from. And he said instructional coaches have power with, not power over, right? And so it's not necessarily that you're there to be somebody's boss and tell somebody what to do, right? But it's really a team of diverse individuals who collaborate together and combine their individual strengths to achieve more than they could have alone, right? And so instructional coaches are teacher leaders that leverage their work to develop teachers' content knowledge, improve the quality of teaching, develop leadership capacity, and foster professional learning communities, right? And so really though, coaching is I would say less about content, because most of the teachers coming in, they know something about math, whether they went through a pre-service teacher program or an alternate certification program. If you're coming to teach math, you know something about it, right? But so where they really need the support is the pedagogy side of it. And that's where Matt is talking about these core practices, is really focusing on developing the pedagogy in teacher education. And so when we have our coaches at our school, I'm not sure in this session, we may have teachers, coaches, administrators. Coaching does show significant improvement over time, but there are some factors that contribute to effective mathematics coaching. And so I want to kind of talk about that so that we have an idea about what's actually needed for the coach to make a difference in the school. And so one of the factors that contribute to effective mathematics coaching, according to Brown, is support and understanding from administration, right? So admin, another thing is that admin should respect and trust the relationship that they have with the coach, but also the relationship that the coach will need to have with the teachers. And Brown also suggested that teachers, coaches, and administrators have common goals in order to maximize time and effort. And so really the thing behind this support from administration is that there needs to be a common and shared vision among the administration, among the teachers, and among the coaches to see how can we work together to make a positive impact for our students in our mathematics programs. And then thirdly, there needs to be a significant amount of time spent that the coach can actually be a coach. And another thing is that Obaro 2010 recommended that for effective coaching to take place, the coach's job description must be clear and significant coach preparation must take place, right? And so the coach needs to be knowledgeable in what it means to be a coach, but also there needs to be a clear expectation of what are you actually expecting from me as the coach. And like I said before, there needs to be a relationship between the teachers and the coaches, because if that relationship is not there, and I'm sure many of you can attest to this, relationships are key in moving forward together as a team, right? And a part of that relationship is building knowledge of each other, building trust with each other, doing community building activities. I reflect back on my time as a coach, which I still am. Like I intentionally do things to have us spend time with each other outside of our math sphere, right? So I've done things like potlucks before COVID. We've done like baby showers for teachers who have given birth. We've went out to lunch together. And so all of those community building activities really help your teacher see you just as a person that's there to support them. And then also in a role where you can kind of relax and get to know each other a little bit more. What's also important is the coach's knowledge and expertise. Um, and then lastly, the time span of coaching, right? And what's important here is that research shows that it really takes 3 years for a coach to really make a significant impact, or the role of the coach to show a significant impact on student achievement. Because the first year, the coach is really building relationships with the teachers. The second year, the coach is really implementing the practice of coaching. And then the third year, they're beginning to perfect their practice and build on what they know. And so what do math coaches help teachers do? Math coaches help teachers to see their current reality, right? And that current reality can be captured in videos, interviewing students, reviewing student work, observing data. A lot of times you could use some kind of pre-observation conversation guide. So the teacher will, interview the teacher to find out that information. And then once you see current reality, then the teacher sets a goal, right? In this case, we're talking about the core practice being a goal. But in a general sense, there could be other goals that the teacher have that you help then to find strategies to support that teacher in meeting those goals. And this is adapted from the work of it's adapted from the work of Jim Knight. And so now we're going to talk about the core practices in math coaching. So I'm going to ask Matt to kind of tell us what this implementation looks like when we're talking about in-service teachers.
So what I think it is first we want to introduce teachers what the core practices are and kind of the grain size of the core practice. So we would look at, for example, facilitating a discussion. We would look at, are we asking, so in that core practice, we're looking at probing versus guiding questions. And we want teachers to look at the core practices and create and select one practice that they would like to have as their goal to be teacher-driven goal to improve on their skills. And then the coach and teachers identify strategies to develop the core practice. And then finally, the teachers and coach engage in the impact cycle to enact on the core practice.
Exactly. And so now I'm going to kind of tell you what I did in my with my coaches. And so first I pretty much gave them a list of the core practices. I didn't go as into detail as I wish I would have. But I definitely gave them that list of core practices. So ideally though, like Matt said, you would kind of give some significant explanation. Matt is holding up the book there, to kind of give teachers sort of an overview of what those core practices are and the explicit meanings for each one. I remember Matt and I was developing this, and I had a couple questions like, what does this one actually mean? And so he had to really expound on what that meant. I believe it was the summative and formative assessment one, but teachers had those same questions. So we want to make sure that the teachers understand what the core practices are. So next we want teachers to choose a goal. And so yes, we want to use the core practices, right? But we don't want to just come in as coaches and say, we're choosing creating a classroom culture. And then we spend the whole year doing that. But then it's hard to get teachers to buy in because it's sort of now your goal that you're forcing on teachers, and then they really don't have ownership. And so what we did was we sent out a survey to teachers in the form of a getting to know you form. So there was really like 13 questions that asked about like the teacher's prior experience, how many years they had spent teaching, their favorite foods, their and a couple of other like funny math questions. But this was one of the questions, right? Like if you could choose one of the 6 core practices to focus on as a math department, which one would it be? And so teachers responded to that. And this is how they responded. So 60% of the teachers said that they would like to use eliciting student thinking as the math department goal. And so because we're in a democracy, right? We went with the majority. And so the focus now for our school year is eliciting student thinking. However, I would also like to say these other couple of people who chose something else, when I'm doing individual coaching with them and I'm supporting them individually, I will just make sure that me as a coach provides some of these resources in case they want to try them as a class. But overall, as a department, we will be focusing on eliciting student thinking. Now, in a session that Matt and I did before, we asked this same question to teachers. And Matt, do you remember what happened here?
We had almost like a split between everybody.
Right. And so in case this happens with you, then obviously there's really not a majority, really, but the learning about students' understanding, but that's not really.
We could have the teachers rank them in order by the 3, 2, and 1 points for which one they like to study, and that way you'd have maybe see a differentiation between those.
Right. So you would definitely need another strategy there, but I would definitely start with the first one to see if you get them, you're lucky like me and you get a majority. And then if not, then you could think about having the teachers rank them as Matt has said. So once you choose your goal, you identify strategies, right? And so some of the things that I have here as suggestions is that within those professional learning communities that you should have at your school, the PLCs that you lead should mostly focus on this core practice that you're trying to get teachers to implement. It should also, or have some component of that, even if it's like the first 15 minutes, right? And then in those PLCs, as the mathematics coach, you should model that core practice, right? And so if you see, Matt and I have tried to sort of incorporate questions to for us to be able to see what you're thinking, right? So we say drop something down in the chat. And so that's how it should be also in your PLCs. Whatever that core practice is, you want to model that for teachers so that they can see it. And then lastly, we don't want the PLCs to only be led by the coach. We want to empower teachers to also be able to take ownership and lead some of those professional developments as well as they're building and learning more about these core practices. So now I'm going to ask Matt to kind of tell us about some of the resources that we have for each core practice, because like when we are identifying strategies, we want to make sure that we have research-based information, and not only research-based, but really solid materials that teachers can use to build that content knowledge around the core practice that they've chosen.
So Teaching Core Practices in Teacher Education by Pam Grossman talks about the process they use to develop the core practices, but also goes into depth of each of the 6 core practices. It has it really breaks down some of different aspects of core practices. For example, aspects of facilitating a math discussion. Make the purpose of the discussion explicit for the students. Further frame the discussion through some subset of the following. Make explicit the expectations for who should be participating, whether individuals or representatives form a group. Establish norms for acceptable forms of talk, common vernacular, and/or mathematics language. Providing examples of constructive talk. Establishing stance toward the use of evidence for supporting claims. So it's really important that we get our students, we have to set those norms for our students of what's appropriate and not appropriate in terms of in discourse in the classroom.
And Matt, to build on that, I've had experiences with some of my teachers who were first year teachers last year, and they were really just trying to teach the content. And he knew the content, but he was sort of teach it in the way that he had been taught. And so now he's really starting to get into the pedagogy of things and shifting away just from the content knowledge. And so, like you're saying, and it's one of the core practices is facilitating a classroom discussion. And so, you know, years ago, the classroom really didn't look like that, the math classroom at least. So the math classroom was more, drill and practice, drill and practice, drill and practice. And as you mentioned before, we shifted to now this constructivist approach where we're really trying to get students to construct mathematics and to think about it conceptually. And so I think teachers really need support in really learning how to facilitate a discussion, because for a long time we weren't expected to do that as math teachers.
And there's so many factors in facilitating discussion. Is we want to anticipate the type of representation that is most beneficial for students to support their intellectual development. So we want our students to show their work through on a piece of paper so we can put up like on an anchor chart.
Mm-hmm.
We want to elicit elements of student thinking that eventually would appear in a public representation. So by taking what they do on a piece of paper, we can put it on an anchor chart so that way they can explain publicly what their thought process was to solve that problem.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that comes to mind with that eliciting student thinking is the strategy of four corners, and I've used that in my classroom. Sort of a what do you know about type of activity where I was introducing students to shapes, to 2D shapes, and they had to tell me all of the things that they knew about it. And I didn't stand up there and like ask each student individually, but what I did was I had them rotate from place to place to place, and they wrote on the anchor chart each group in a different color, and it just let me know what they were thinking. And like you said, at the end they were then able to present their ideas and make connections with what their classmates said.
And really facilitating the discussion is making strategic decisions based on your formative assessment of student progress. So you want to talk about the ideas that you're noticing as you go through the classroom. And you also want to think about how and what ideas are going to be represented in terms of the class discussion. And when we facilitate that discussion, we want to recognize the need for and enact particular facilitation moves, specifically, but not limited to, using students' ideas as resource to move the discussion forward. So this is going to be a student-centered discussion versus a teacher-led discussion.
Exactly.
So that means the teacher is going to put questions out there that probe the student's knowledge and allows the student to expand their thoughts versus the teacher guiding the students to come up with the teacher thoughts. So we want to press students for clarification or elaboration. We want students to explain the why and the how behind their ideas. We want to rephrase or revoice students' contributions. So if a student in the classroom has an excellent idea, we want to rephrase that because maybe it will help other students in the classroom understand that idea.
And then building on that, we could also ask students to rephrase it.
Exactly. And we also want asking students to comment on one another's thinking.
Exactly, yep.
And we also have to use wait time.
Yes, that's extremely important.
And it's also important that we have students speak with a partner before sharing with the class, because it allows students to have a zero opportunity for a low chance opportunity where they can talk just to one person, and allows the teacher to go around the room and pick up formative assessment through like a think, pair, share. Mm-hmm. So in closing the discussion, We're using facilitation moves that could include asking students to sum up their thinking. Asking students, how do we think our thinking has changed today? Was there anything we were confused about? What do you want to learn more about the concepts that we learned today? So these are all important concepts that come into facilitating the discussion. And it's really probing student thinking to get students to think at a higher level and to make meaning with their learning. So other resources we could use is a chapter 8 from Taking Action, Implementing Effective Mathematics Teaching Practices, which is eliciting student ideas.
We could also look at leading a discussion in the Taking Action book. It's either chapter 7 or chapter 8 or one of the chapters in there that helps you with, in addition to the Grossman book, you can also use this book for additional support with leading and facilitating a discussion.
And we can also look at chapter 7 from Using Research to Improve Instruction. So creating a classroom culture. And, this is a challenging thing for new teachers. So it's really important that we really break down the key components of a strong classroom culture.
Mm-hmm.
And building it so that way teachers can create that positive classroom. So that way we can have the teacher can facilitate strong student discourse.
Exactly. We know that students learn better when they feel like they're in a safe environment, when they feel that they're supported, they're encouraged, they're cared for. And so the classroom culture is extremely important if we want to really move learning forward and go deeper into where students are learning at higher levels.
And there was a recent publication in 2017 from Mathematics Teaching in Middle School that looked at assessing student understanding. So what's it mean in terms of formative and summative assessments in the classroom? So that's another resource we could use.
Also, another resource is explaining and scaffolding. NCTM came out with a really great article about really scaffolding for access to productive struggle, right? A lot of times we as teachers want to jump in really quick and save the day. But as Matt said earlier, we have to have that wait time so that students can engage in that productive struggle. Because if we jump in and save them all the time, then that's really setting them up for, it's setting them up to expect that in situations where that's not going to happen. And one of those places is in the assessment, right? That end of the year assessment.
And scaffolding allows for all students to access high quality math learning.
Right. And so scaffolding should be used to build students up to get to a place, but not to stay at that sort of basic.
So helping students to work together using high-performing collaborative teams for mathematics comes from the book Common Core Mathematics in a PLC at Work for middle school. And it's a fantastic book that goes over the PLC process in terms of the Common Core. So what we're looking at, it's getting students to discuss their thinking and build upon their thinking and become more precise about their thinking. So that's another great resource.
Right. And we know when students work together, it helps them to build community and to also build confidence in the mathematics classroom. Another resource is Teacher Education by Design, which I didn't really know about before, and Matt told me about it. And so it's really a great resource that I'm gonna let Matt tell you more about.
So the Teacher Education by Design is a project from the University of Washington, which, as you guys remember, was one of the 9 universities that participated in the development of core practices. TED.org hosts an online open source library of curricular and pedagogical tasks and tools for teacher educators. These resources are organized around a framework based on for practice-based teacher education that reaches across grade levels and content areas, providing teachers with a common language for talking about pedagogy. Hence, our core practices, and are designed based on our best knowledge about how professionals learn to practice the learning cycle, organize teachers' learning into a staged approach that includes exposure to representations of practice, engagement, in approximations of practice, and opportunities to enact and analyze practice. Aligned with this framework, we offer content-specific instructional activities which teachers can educate and engage teachers. The TED instructional activities are vehicles teacher educators can use to engage teachers in learning about and talking about high leverage teaching practices. For each instructional activity, TED offers resources and tools, including primer documents, videos of the activity, planning protocols, questions for debriefing, enactments, and more. So the TED website is stuff that's already made that you as a math coach can take and use with your teachers to help improve their practices with the core practices. So, Queshonda, I mean, that'd be really cool to use with your teachers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and another really great website is Teaching Works, which we've kind of referred to earlier in the presentation. So I'm going to actually show you some things that are really cool on this website.
And Teaching Works is straight out of the University of Michigan, which is one of the 9 institutes or universities that worked on worked on core practices.
Right, core practices. And so they have some curriculum resources on here that help teachers to understand better high leverage practices. And so if you scroll down here, they have I think it's about 16 or 17 here of the high leverage practices that they have. But regarding the core practices, you could actually click on these and they have information. So we kind of just talked about leading a discussion, right? Or facilitating a discussion, or eliciting student ideas, or explaining and scaffolding. So if you click here where it says learn more, they actually have more information where you can just send this link to your teachers and have them read on it. Or maybe you want to encourage one of your teachers to lead some kind of professional development where where they convey this information to other teachers. Then they have this stuff right here, right? Like they talk about the elements of the practice, right? Discussion enabling, discussion leading, and then they actually have resources that you can download right here on their website. And then it's even content specific, right? Because I know that some of you may be elementary coaches where you do several of the content areas. So it helps you to see what it looks like in science, math, English, social studies. And so this is a really great resource that you can go to and navigate easily to kind of convey that information about core practices. So then I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint, but that's a really great resource that you can use with your teachers. So let's get back to the PowerPoint. Okay, that's the PowerPoint. Good.
So these are probing STEM questions. So when my pre-service teachers, we part of our Math Methods 1, we start talking about 3-act lessons and about inquiry-based math instruction. And one of the questions that the students have is, or my pre-service teachers have, is what do you do when a student doesn't understand and doesn't get it? How do you probe that student to become more engaged? And I thought about it, and I was like, all right, it's a good question. So I developed this, I took this from the Van de Waal 10th edition text, where it goes over the before phase questions. So if a student, and the way in our classes, we watch a 3-act lesson, and I go around during the before phase and I ask I can use these 6 different bullet points, and I could ask 6 different questions to spur student thinking on. Because what the students are trying to do is they're trying to gain information out of me, but what I'm actually doing is I'm probing their thinking. So I'm asking them, do we have enough information? So I'm looking to see at how they synthesize their information. What is the problem asking? Looks at and see if they really understand what the task is asking. Because most of our students said they don't understand. Well, where do you not understand? They're not, well, I don't know. Well, these questions allow for you to probe and figure out where your students are at in the before phase. So the during phase is the students are looking at, they've been, before phase, we look at what is the question. The during phase we're looking at is answering that question. So these questions here allow us to probe students and to explain their thinking. So tell me what you're doing. Why did you do that? How did you organize your information? Let's say you have a student that's advanced and they've already solved the problem. Think of a different strategy to solve or manipulate that you might try. So these questions allow for teachers to, in their toolbox, and what I have cut out for the student or my pre-service teachers is I created a bookmark that they can give to their cooperating teacher, and they cut this in half so that way their teacher has a bookmark with these questions. So they can be carrying that around the room with their, whoever way they collect their formative assessment. So in the after phase, we look at, I wonder what happens if you tried. So these are really good questions to get students to summarize their thinking and to examine their thinking, almost a metacognition.
It's a great way for eliciting student ideas and student thinking.
And it allows for the teacher to prepare some students to go up to the board to explain their thinking to others by comparing and contrasting 2 correct answers. How are they the same? How are they different? So it's not just a matter of getting the question right. It's a matter of looking at the thinking behind getting the question.
Right.
So.
Exactly. So now in this next section, we're going to talk to you about the impact cycle, right? And the impact cycle really happens once you have informed your teachers of what the core practices are. You have allowed your teachers to choose a goal as a department, and you've informed them of the different strategies that can be used to meet the goal of the core practice that they chose. So the impact cycle is really looking at where teachers already are with that particular goal. So if they chose eliciting student thinking, you may just want to see what that looks like already in their classroom before you start doing anything. After you look at that, you then want teachers to kind of learn more about the practice and how exactly they want to implement it into their classroom. And maybe they may ask you as the coach, well, can you come and model this for me? Can I see what it looks like? Or can I go to another teacher's classroom to see what it looks like? Or can we co-teach it together? And that really takes place in the learn phase. And then the improve phase, the way that we've adapted it is it's reflecting on what happened. And so you ask those questions. How do you think it went? What would you change if you wanted to make it, if you wanted to do something different? And then we just keep this cycle going until we've really met the goal that we want to meet. And these core practices are so awesome because they're broad enough where you can actually just keep building on what you already know, right? Like you can never elicit student ideas too much, right? Because that's what you're doing all the time. You're eliciting student ideas when you give them a summative assessment. You're eliciting student ideas when you give them a formative assessment. You're eliciting student ideas when you're engaging in practice. You're eliciting student ideas even when notes are being taken. And so you could even begin to think about, okay, what are some specific strategies that we could do at each of these stages? right? Because when you're engaging students in a lesson, you may ask them to hold up the whiteboards and you've seen what they're thinking. Or you may ask them to engage in some kind of online platform where the answers come straight to you. Whereas on a test, it's going to look completely different. And so Matt did a training at the state conference about what tests look like and what those tests allow students to do. Are they allowing students to communicate mathematics? Are they allowing students to engage in reasoning and proof? And so we could look at that and say, are we effectively eliciting student ideas on assessment? And so, because I know that it's tempting to say, well, it's just one core practice and it's the whole year. Aren't we going to get tired of that? But the thing is, there's different ways or different components that you could apply that core practice to. And so it looks like you want to jump in there, Matt.
Excellent point, Queshonda. And it's actually, keep going. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, so it's really, it really helps you to kind of look at what the core practice looks like at every stage of instruction. And so you just develop that throughout the year. And then the next year you go on to something else with that still in your tool belt of all of the things that you learned in the previous year. And so I really already went into learn, looking at those different stages. Improve, I kind of looked at that. So I want to stop here at the learning walks, and I want us to pause here, Matt, and kind of talk about this. So before we chat about this a little bit, I want you to put in the chat if you've ever heard what a learning walk is, or if you've ever went on it, and what was your experience like. So take about 30 seconds to kind of type that in the chat. And then we'll talk a little bit about what learning walks are, how I've implemented it in the past, and how I plan on adapting it to look at it within this core practice framework. Okay, so feel free to keep on chatting in there. And so Matt was really excited, so I'm going to kind of let him talk about it first before I go into it. But he was really excited to put this in a presentation. So Matt, tell us a little bit about why you wanted to do that.
My first year teaching, I was in a middle school, and we had 3 math teachers at each grade level. And I was, of the 9 math teachers, I was the newest teacher, and the second newest teacher had 5 years of experience. So it was one of the best opportunities I ever had. Was my math coach sat in and taught my classes while I went and watched all of the experienced math coaches in my school. And I looked for specific, basically, core practices and how they enacted on those core practices. And it kind of helped me understand how to implement better classroom management procedures for my class, how they use formative assessments. And that learning walk was so powerful for me, because I saw 4 different teachers for 4 different periods, that it really helped improve my practices that school year. So when Queshonda and I were talking about core practices and how we can implement it, we thought that learning walks would be a great way for teachers to see how other teachers implement core practices effectively. And the core practices allow us as a starting point for certain things to look for.
Yeah. So I agree. Like, learning walks are so awesome. I went on my first learning walk my 3rd year teaching. Like, I didn't even get to do it my first year, but when I did it, it was so amazing. Because when you're in somebody else's classroom, right, you are, and I think what makes it special is because it's your colleagues. So it's people that you already know. Maybe you eat lunch with them. maybe you teach the same subject area of them, maybe you don't. But being in those classrooms and seeing them in action, so to say, really helps you to be able to pick up strategies that you wouldn't have otherwise done. It also will make you reflect on what you're doing in your own classroom, and maybe make you appreciate more what you're doing in your own classroom. Or maybe it will encourage you to ask yourself, how could I do this differently in my classroom? Or how could I apply this directly in my classroom? And so one of the things that I really picked up was the organization piece at home. And naturally, I'm not an organized person, but really going into others' classrooms and seeing how they organize what they organize, it completely transformed my teaching in that regard. There's a somebody who said this, but said that the best teachers are thieves. And the thieves that they're talking about is stealing practices from other teachers, right? And that's really what the core practices are about: finding the best ways of teaching, and taking it for yourself and applying it in your classroom. And so what we did on our learning walks, when I became a coach, was our district coach came in for the whole day, all 6 periods, and he subbed in each of the teachers' classrooms as we went and looked at the other teachers' classes. And the teachers took notes on some of the good things they saw and some of the areas for improvement. And so the way that we wanted to implement it for core practices was, once we've got into the swing of things, maybe November, we would go into each other's classrooms and we would look specifically at how is this teacher implementing eliciting student thinking, right? Their particular core practice. How could we encourage her to do it, to build on, what she's already doing or what he's already doing? Or how could I apply this in my own classroom? And so the learning walks that we would take would just focus specifically on the core practice that we choose. And then based on what we learn in those learning walks, we would then start the impact cycle over. And so that's how we plan on implementing core practices.
So we look at core practices as the starting point of this impact cycle, and to improve student learning and student outcomes.
Exactly. And we really wanted to, as a coach, right? So I still plan on working with teachers on their specific goals. Like, some teacher really wanted to focus on classroom management because she really struggled in that area, whereas the other teachers may not struggle in that area. So I would still provide individual coaching to help support her in that area. But as a team, as a like a theme for the year, it would be that core practice that we're all focusing on, that we're all improving in, that we're all trying to get better on. And then from year to year, we just continue with different core practices until we have a whole tool belt of core practices that we can put in place right in the classroom in real time, with the ultimate goal of improving student learning.
Thank you for attending our presentation. I would like to dedicate this presentation to Dr. Ben Lindeman, who was my mentor. He worked for he was a mathematics associate in the mathematics bureau of the New York State Education Department in 1980. He retired in 1995. And from 95 to 2015, he was a private mathematics educational consultant. He presented at so many NCTM conferences, and he is currently in the New York Teachers of Mathematics, or Teachers of New York State Association of Mathematics Hall of Fame. And I know he's not here today, but I know he would be really proud that we presented.
Shout out to you, Dr. Benjamin. Or is it not Dr.?
Yeah, it is Dr. Benjamin Lindeman.
I thought so. Shout out to you, Dr. Benjamin.
So thank you for attending our session on core practices for math coaches and administrators. And we hope that you found something that you can take away to help improve the teachers at your school.
And feel free to reach out to us. Our emails are right there, mobrien4@usf.edu, and QJ, it should be a J in the middle, QJ Kudaisi, it's okay, QJ Kudaisi@usf.edu. So feel free to reach out to us. And we hope you have a great rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Cut.
Oh, I'm tired.
Yeah. All right. That feels good. I gave him a no, but like